I'm going to focus on what Xabier Barandiaran and colleagues call the individuality criterion of agency. An individual, in the sense that it's being used here, is just a system that is actually distinct from its environment and from other individuals. So essentially, I'm addressing what kinds of groups might qualify as group agents. There's a lot of disagreement on this topic in the literature. So for instance, Raimo Tuomela maintained that two people committed to acting together, for instance to painting a house together, potentially qualifies as a group agent. In contrast, Christian List and Philip Pettit maintain that in order for a group to count as the right kind of group, it has to be able to survive through changes in membership, which is clearly a criterion that Tuomela's account seems incapable of satisfying. All I aim to do with this presentation is to clarify the discussions on what kinds of groups are proper groups by drawing the attention of philosophers of group agency to the literature on minimal agency, specifically to the work of enactivists like Ezequiel Di Paolo and Evan Thompson. It's already a common view in the literature that there are group agents if there are groups that satisfy the requirements of singular agency, and so the key move that I want to make here is to exploit this assumption, specifically by highlighting the difference between what I call global and local accounts of individuality. A global account is applicable to all agents and does not mention the specific contingent features of a particular agent or particular kind of agent. Local accounts, then, are obviously more specific accounts. So far, I believe that in the group agency literature, only local accounts have really been offered, with the exception perhaps of Pauer-Studer's argument for a constitutive account of group agency. However, I don't endorse constitutivism because it assumes that agents, group agents at least, must have minds, which is a point that I'll sort of address when I get to talking about Rovane as well. The problem with local accounts is that they require a global account to verify whether or not they're true. So if groups are agents because they satisfy the demands of that other agents satisfy, then it's not sufficient to say that a collection of people working together forms the kind of system capable of agency. We need to know what kind of unity is required of a system for it to be capable of agency in the first place. So I'm going to begin by stating some assumptions, and then I'll expand on what I mean by global and local accounts of individuality, and then I'll move straight to looking at existing accounts, specifically Rovane's and Tuomela's local accounts, and then I'll move to the global autonomous individuation account and defend that. So let's begin by looking at a few assumptions that both underlie and drive the argument being made here. I take these to be commonly accepted, be it sort of implicitly or explicitly, but nevertheless I take these to be common assumptions in the literature. So first, I think that agency is objective, by which I mean that when we talk about agency or group agents, we're not speaking metaphorically or using this sort of language because it happens to be useful. At least here my focus is rather on the ontology of agency and the potential for groups to really be agents. Second, I think that all agents are systems capable of acting according to norms. If we examine any account of agency or group agency, we tend to find that this basic view holds across all of them. So my focus here is on the systems in question. So one way to put the question being addressed here is, what kinds of systems are capable of action? And finally, it follows from these first two assumptions that agents are self-individuating systems, and this just means that the boundaries of an agent are given in some way by the structure of that agent itself. So when considering accounts of individuality then, the first thing that we ought to ask is, does this account explain how agents define their own boundaries? And as we'll see when we look at the three different accounts that I'm going to address here, all of them do satisfy these criteria. Finally, before we look at the accounts on offer, I want to restate the difference between global and local accounts of individuality and to expand on the importance of the differences between them. So, a global account is one that describes the process by which any agent self-individuates. So it should be applicable to all biological and non-biological agents in equal measure. Importantly, A global account is not dependent on the contingent features of any particular agent. It can't say, for instance, that an agent must have 2 arms and 2 legs. So with this in mind, I think the best option we have for a global account of individuality is a minimal account of individuality. We want, as best we can, to avoid assumptions about what is and is not an agent, although we clearly have to start somewhere. So by focusing on minimal agents, things like bacteria for instance, we strip back a great deal of complexity and we're left with something close to a pure agent. Local accounts of individuality, on the other hand, are focused on the particular features of a given kind of agent. A definition of human agency is a local account, for example. We might develop a local account because we want something that more easily applies in this particular case, kind of like using a calculator to do long division instead of paper to make it easier. These accounts are fine, they're not necessarily wrong, but importantly, they're only verifiable with reference to a global account, the same way that a calculator might be wrong if it's been coded incorrectly. So we want a global account because they include all possible agents while also not assuming beforehand what is and is not an agent, at least insofar as that's possible. Local accounts of individuality, on the other hand, are obviously limited in that they can apply to the agents that they're designed for only, which leads to accounts of group agency that are too narrow, since they tend to exclude non-human groups, such as beehives or ant colonies, without even considering the possibility that these are group agents, and they tend to carry the baggage of this or that particular philosopher's assumptions concerning what groups do and don't count. So this may lead them to be either too inclusive, as List and Pettit might say of Tuomela's views, or too exclusive, as Tuomela might say of List and Pettit. So again, the local accounts are not necessarily wrong. They might be correct in the cases that they were designed for, and might even be pragmatically useful in those cases, but we can't know whether they're correct in those cases, or whether they've been too exclusive or inclusive without comparing them to a global account. So let's look at our first definition of individuality. So Carol Rovane defines singular agency by saying, wherever there is a commitment to meeting the normative requirements that define individual rationality, there is an individual agent. So the normative requirements in question are consistency, which requires the agent to resolve conflicting beliefs, closure, or accepting the implications of one's beliefs, and transitivity, or ordering one's preferences. There are group agents, Rovane says, so long as the conditions of individual agency are satisfied by a group of humans. And Rovane's account satisfies the self-individuation requirement, at least in the case of group agents, because the group is demarcated from its environment and from other agents by the commitment condition. Those people who are together committed to satisfying the normative requirements of rationality and who are together resolving, accepting, and ordering the same set of beliefs and preferences form the group agent, and everyone and everything else doesn't. So what's wrong with Rovane's account? So first of all, Rovane at various points in her discussion refers to humans as if humans are the basis upon which we should develop our account of agency. And this, I believe, is what leads to her definition of singular agency and hence to Rovane's assertion that groups must have beliefs, commitments, and preferences. Personally, I find the idea that groups have mental states in any non-trivial sense to be metaphysically dubious. And I believe that this view, that groups have minds, which is held by both Rovane as well as by Pauer-Studer, stems from their taking accounts of human agency as their starting points. And this leads to an instance of what Fred Adams and Kenneth Izawa call the coupling constitution fallacy. So this fallacy occurs when we move from the observation that process X is causally connected to process Y, to the view that X is constitutive of Y. So here, the move is from the observation that, in humans, having a mind is causally connected to our agency, to the view that mindedness is constitutive of agency in general. Furthermore, I believe that we can conceptually keep mindedness and agency separate, and given how contentious any definition of mind or mental is, I think it's at least a methodologically good idea to keep them separate when talking about agency. More straightforwardly, Rovane defines a group agent as a group of people who instantiate singular agency. This excludes non-human animals as well as the tools that humans use to help the group function. Now, tools may or may not count as a part of the group. The important point here is that we cannot presume that they don't from the outset. Given both of these points, I think it's evident that Rovane's account is at least a local account. Even if you take issue with my arguments concerning groups and minds, it might be that groups of the kind Rovane is interested in do have mental properties, or at least that they have mental properties according to a particular view of mental properties, even if I'm personally unconvinced. The account is still only applicable to those specific human groups, and as I've argued earlier, in the absence of a global account, we can't even know if the account works there. Tuomela also provides a substantive local account of group individuality. For Tuomela, a group agent is a we-mode group that exists when it is collectively accepted by the members of that group as existing. So to think or act in the we mode requires individuals to intend to act together for the same authoritative group reason, as well as satisfying certain collectivity requirements, which Tuomela summarizes as a kind of necessarily being in the same boat condition. Essentially, the idea is that people can either act or intend according to their own reasons, or they can do so due to their membership in a group, whose views they must necessarily endorse in their capacity as a group member. This second we-mode means of existing is conceived as top-down rather than bottom-up. The group structure causally influences the world by being the source of action. In this case, the idea of the group being an individual for itself is supposed to be given by the group members identifying strongly with and as parts of the group. So, their acceptance of the group as a group agent just is the group agent's acceptance of itself as a group agent, and hence its self-defined individuality. Okay, so onto the problems with Tuomela's account. So first of all, I think that there is an ontological gap between thinking of group agents as real and group agents having actual causal powers in Tuomela's arguments that cannot be filled without a global definition of individuality. So for Tuomela, group agents exist as real entities because we think them into existence and act according to that thinking. So group agents are ontologically dependent on the psychological states of their members. Tuomela does claim that group agents are partly fictitious entities, by which he means the intentional states, attitudes, beliefs, and so on that are assigned to them are imaginary. However, he also maintains that they have real causal powers and are hence only partly fictitious. These real causal powers depend on the group agent being a real social system that has its objective causal powers precisely because of the collective we-mode thinking its members engage in due to their acceptance of the group's existence and their membership in that group. I think there are contradictions here, so Tuomela wants to account both for the idea that human group agents depend on the imaginations of the people who form them, and that they are real entities that recursively influence those people. But he tries to do so without positing any further facts about the group agent as a being in itself outside of its relation to its members. His account therefore suggests that people imagine they are members of a group and act according to their imagined membership, and also that group agents are real entities with genuine causal powers, due to their causing people to act in certain ways. But, on his account, there is no reason to view a group's members as acting because of the group's causal powers. Rather, it is the members' own imaginations that cause them to act, so hence there is an ontological gap. This gap, I think, is easily filled if we have a global account of individuality. So using this global account, we could examine if the kinds of groups that humans think up and act into existence on Tuomela's account constitute proper groups. Tuomela has created space for this kind of analysis when he asserts that group agents are real social systems and that it's this system that has causal influence. The global account of individuality explains the nature of this social system, and if we take social system in Tuomela to stand in for a fleshed out global account, then I think the ontological gap can be closed. So this is a special instance of a local account requiring a global account for verification. And second, as with Rovane, Tuomela focuses on human group agents, that is, groups made up of humans, so the same issues that applied there apply here. Tuomela excludes non-human groups and assumes the material constitution of group agents beforehand. And this means that his account is necessarily a local account, so again, we can't know if it's correct in the absence of a global account. For a global account, I think a promising concept of individuality from the minimal agency literature is autonomy, as understood in Ezequiel Di Paolo and Evan Thompson, which they argue provides the criteria for the self-individuation of bodies where a body is not constituted exclusively by its biochemical or physiological processes. This last point is important for the possibility of group agents on the autonomous individuation account, since groups are clearly not biochemically or physiologically constituted bodies. There are two aspects to autonomy: operational closure and precariousness. So for a system to be operationally closed, its constitutive processes must collectively, actively produce and sustain those self-same processes. So if process A sustains process B, which sustains process C, which sustains process A, then the system ABC is operationally closed. We can think of the ways in which a plant's roots, stems, and leaves all sustain themselves and each other, for instance. So without one of these components, the other processes in the plant will eventually stop functioning and the whole system will shut down. Being self-sustaining, however, does not imply that an operationally closed system is cut off from its environment. As Di Paolo and Thompson note, there are a few ways in which other processes might influence the system without thereby being a part of the system. So first of all, some processes enable the system in question while not themselves being enabled by the system. In plants, the sun acts as an enabling condition for their photosynthesis, while obviously not being sustained by plant life itself. Likewise, for groups, we could consider the conditions of capitalism broadly as enabling conditions for corporations. And furthermore, there are processes that act as boundaries and constraints for operationally closed systems. These can be the same processes that enable the system in the first place. There may, however, also be boundaries that are not created by the enabling conditions of that system, as minimum wage laws and the threat of union action are against modern corporations. So note, as Di Paolo et al. Point out, that these enabling and binding conditions are implied by the organization of the system in question. The sun is a necessary enabling condition for the plant, as determined by the organizational processes of the plant. So we, as external observers, may or may not notice this enabling condition, but it exists regardless. And in this sense, operational closure generates individuality for the agent and distinguishes it from its environment, while giving us as external observers a useful tool for uncovering the structures of the agentive system in a non-arbitrary manner. And finally, by precariousness is meant in the absence of the enabling relations established by the operationally closed network, a process belonging to the network will stop or run down. So, all of the processes that are a part of a system are precarious because they are actively enabled by the other processes in that system. This aspect of agency accounts for the constantly active nature of agency and excludes things like crystals, which likely satisfy the operational closure criterion from counting as self-individuating in the agentive sense. So just to quickly summarize the argument that was made here, if there are group agents, then they must be self-individuating systems. This aspect, individuality, is often overlooked, and when it's not, we tend to find only local accounts of individuality. A global account that applies to all agents is required in order to, first of all, show that there are group agents at all, and show what kinds of groups can be group agents, and second, to verify the local accounts that we have. Finally, the autonomous individuation account, as I have argued, satisfies all of the requirements and provides an operational definition that is readily applicable to group agents.